We are super excited to be able to host this meeting. I think it was more than a year and a half ago when we conceived of this idea that we would collaborate together and bring the effort trial to the UK. I want to thank Danny for all her earnest and hard and diligent work in getting to this point where we're ready to launch in the UK or near ready, which we'll explain more details in a minute. So I have a slide deck. I hope that you're on Zoom and you can see the slide deck. If you can't, it is available on our website, criticalcarenutrition.com. If you go and search for the presentations, then you'll be able to see the presentation, download it, it's on the top of the presentation list. So great, let me just jump right in then. We're gonna talk about the effort trial today, which is a rather an innovative trial design where we call it a multi-center, pragmatic, volunteer-driven, registry-based, randomized controlled trial. So we aim to enroll 4,000 nutritionally high-risk patients where the practitioner gets randomized to prescribe a higher dose of 2.2 grams per kilogram per day, or ride along with usual care with 1.2 or less grams per kilogram per day. And our primary outcome is 60-day mortality. I think before we go into the details of the trial, I want to just go at a high level and share this paper that was published a couple of years ago that identified the research priorities for critical care nutrition. And the top research priority is sorting out this age-old question of what's the right dose of protein. And I've underlined many of the different aspects in red that will be touched on by the effort trial. So what I'm trying to say, this is a high priority question or series of questions for us as a critical care nutrition community. And I'm super pleased to be able to partner with you in the UK and with other dietitians and nutritionists around the world to collaborate in a way that we've never collaborated before to enable us to do this participatory trial. This work really stems from our lived experience with the International Nutrition Survey, and we've had a lot of support from the UK in years past. 37 ICUs in the UK have participated in the International Nutrition Survey over the last few years, and so that observational study where we would audit your practice, you would voluntarily collect the data, submit it to us, and then we give you back a benchmark report that identifies what's going on at your site. This observational study, the INS, and where we audited our practice, this is really the precursor to the effort trial, where you voluntarily collected data and we gave you something that was of value to you, a benchmark report to help drive process improvement locally. We're doing the same thing. The only thing that's different, though, is we have added a randomization schema to randomize you to a high or a usual care dose of protein. Our hypothesis is, compared to those prescribed the usual dose, a prescription of a higher dose will not only lead to more protein being delivered, but also that will translate into better outcomes for these nutritionally high-risk, critically ill patients. And that's another key feature of the effort trial, is that we're focusing on nutritionally high-risk patients. Unfortunately, a lot of published large-scale RCTs of nutrition take heterogeneous groups of patients with a variety or a varying nutrition risk. And, maybe it's no surprise that we can't show a positive treatment effect of nutrition when we're enrolling, a lot of mixed patients with many with low nutritional risk. So another unique feature of this trial is we're only aiming to enroll high-risk patients. Now, some of you may realize that I'm a bit partial to the Nutrix score, but you'll also be overjoyed to know that that's not part of the enrollment criteria, because I know that it's time-consuming for you to do that real time. And so the way we're defining high risk in this trial are the following 5 criteria, which you can see on that slide. Low BMI or high BMI, or the extremes of BMI. We've published prior work showing that those are patients who benefit more from optimal nutrition. Moderate to severe malnutrition as defined by local standards. We don't say what assessment tool you need to use, but rather whatever tool you use or tools, you'll enter that in the data that we collect so that we know what criterion you use to define moderate to severe malnutrition. I'm on slide 7, which shows the study population, and we are defining the different nutritional high-risk criteria: low, high BMI, moderate to severe malnutrition, frailty, sarcopenia, and any patient who has a projected long length of stay as defined by expected duration mechanical ventilation of more than 4 days. So they have to be 18, meet one, at least one, I mean, they can have more, but at least one of those criteria, and expected to be ventilated for a minimum of 48 hours. Obviously, we don't want patients who are doing well, who are going to get extubated and be out the door, nor do we want patients who are doing so poorly that they're going to die in the next few days. But those high-risk patients who are going to be on their back, ventilated for a couple of days, 3, 4, 5, 6 days, maybe in ICU 7, 8, 9 days. Those are the kinds of patients that we want enrolled in this trial. In a pragmatic trial, we have very few exclusion criteria. We do have a 96-hour cutoff, so that if you've been ventilated for more than 96 hours, you probably had some exposure to some nutrition already. So, you know, if you've had a lot of nutrition and then we randomize you to the low group, that would be odd. Or if you've had no nutrition and we randomize you to the high group, that wouldn't work well. And so you've got 96 hours to enroll somebody. Expected death or withdrawal within the 7 days is an exclusion criteria. Pregnancy, for obvious reasons. And then number 4, I'm going to come back to that a little bit later, but realize that if there are unique features of a particular patient in front of you where perhaps you don't have equipoise, you have the right to be able to, from a patient safety point of view, exclude them. And we will ask you to document your reason for that. And I'll talk, that's a very frequent exclusion criteria. So I'm going to come back and talk about that one in a little bit later. Excuse me. And then number 5, if the patient's PN dependent and you don't have sufficient products with adequate nitrogen concentration, then you won't be, and you know, to reach that high level, then obviously they'll have to be excluded as well. It's not my intent to go through the whole protocol or these issues in detail. As you know, we have a lot of documentation on the web where you can get access to the protocol, the data collection form, the procedures manual. I'm just going to make a few more high-level comments about the trial, and then I'll pause just to see if there are specific questions about the details of the EFFORT trial. So similar to the INS in past years, we cluster the data around 3 or 4 topics. We want to be able to adequately describe the patients that are enrolled in the EFFORT trial. We want to characterize their nutritional status quite well. And perhaps what's new this year is adding that frailty and sarcopenia questionnaire. There's a questionnaire-based, very short, 2-minute questions that you need somebody to be able to ask those questions to, and likely the patients won't. And so you'll need a family member at some point to be able to respond and help you answer the frailty and sarcopenia questionnaire. Nutrition processes of care. So like in times past, you're collecting daily data on nutrition, type of nutrition, when it started, how much, etc. And then some labs, not that we're mandating any blood work, but just that if you have collected glucose, renal function, phosphate, triglycerides, that kind of stuff, we'll capture it in the CRF. And then lastly, the last slide where I was just going to give you a high-level overview of the EFFORT trial. the outcomes that we're interested in are all the outcomes that we can capture from a hospital record. So these are de-identified data that just help us understand nutritional intake. A new outcome for many of you would be what we call persistent organ dysfunction, or PODS. And we just need to be able to talk about the use of vasopressors, renal replacement therapy, and duration of mechanical ventilation. So that stuff in red is new, but everything else is the same as to what we've been doing in past years in terms of various durations and mortalities and readmissions. Okay, folks, any high-level questions on the effort trial that I can help with?
Who do you consider to be a PI? Can it be only clinician, or can it be nurse and dietitian role?
Yeah, you know, can I answer that question in a few slides? I'm going to come back and talk about that.
Perfect. And can I have one more question as well?
Sure.
You were talking about pregnancy being exclusion criteria.
Yeah.
We don't screen females for pregnancy. Do you provide pregnancy tests? No.
It would be whatever clinical or biochemical diagnosis you would make. So if through your whatever approach you have, you find a pregnant woman, I wouldn't include it. Meaning, okay. I'm not mandating a beta HCG test, but whatever diagnostic criteria you use is sufficient for me.
Excuse me, Darren, I do have a question from Sarah Gavin. She wants to know how, if they're on the list for the first wave, how do they know that?
Oh, I think, Sarah, I'm almost certain that you're not, but can you send me an email if that's possible, and I'll double check when I get back to my office.
Okay, that's the only question.
Great. So I think it would be good to sort of just go over from the study's point of view where we're at and what the issues are. I'll tell you in a minute how many sites are engaged and how many patients are enrolled, et cetera, and how the study is going. But from my point of view, the big three things that keep me awake at night are getting more sites engaged, getting more patients enrolled and enrolled faster, and then getting adequate separation in the protein dose between the two groups. So let's talk about that sort of one at a time. So for those of you out there, these are where we're going to review the suitability of each site being able to join this global collaborative. A little bit different from the INS, because this is now research. We have a different set of requirements for getting involved in this. You have to have some documented a way of saying that you're knowledgeable about critical care nutrition. Now, I don't want to get into specifics because we're actually quite loose about what you submit, but if you're a dietitian, you must have some license. If you're a doctor, you're probably a CV, something that says I'm knowledgeable about critical care nutrition. What is a barrier for some sites is having documentation that they have GCP or good clinical practice training. Or I don't know, I forgot to ask you if there's something similar in the UK. It's the same. And do institutions usually make that available to their staff? Okay. So hopefully that's not a barrier to you. If it is, we have access to our hospital's account where we can lend that to you if you need access to get some online training. But that certificate is part of the registration process. Confirm that the site has overall equipoise and is willing to abide by the randomization schema and not overfeed patients. So you'll be asked to tick a box and attest that, yeah, you plan on, if the patient's randomized to the high, you're going to go high, or low, you're going to go low. You're not going to, oh, I don't want to do that, I'm just going to change things up. No, that's not allowed. You have to be strictly obey the randomization schema. Another one of the suitability criteria is that you have some form of a standard feeding protocol. We don't really specify what the nature of the feeding protocol is. I'd love you if you were using a volume-based or a PEP-up-based feeding protocol, but really what the point here is, I know from working in hundreds of ICUs that ICUs that have a standardized approach are going to be more likely to achieve higher goal, higher intake, and we're quite worried about getting the high protein dose in. And so I want to make sure that you have good basic standardized feeding protocols happening in your ICU. You also have to confirm that you have a range of commercial products available to you, both enteral and parenteral and protein supplements. Did you want to make a comment about the donation?
Yes. So I can also confirm that Nutrinovo will provide a box of ProSource to each site that participates. So hopefully, I know that it's difficult for sites to get protein supplements because of the cost. So we can help some way to help you to achieve the higher protein doses, but it is only a box. But hopefully that's helpful to some sites.
Great, thanks. Have obtained ethics approval. Well, of course, you guys have a national ethics approval. So as soon as Danny has that documentation, then that serves as a documentation. And then the last thing you'll do on the registration page is to provide an electronic signature that you're committing to enrolling a minimum of 30 patients over the next 2 to 3 years. So that's what you're looking at to join the collaborative. I forgot to mention when I was talking about the principal investigators at the top, the principal investigators need to be knowledgeable about critical care nutrition. So we typically like to have a physician and a dietitian. I imagine most of the work of the trial will be done by the dietitians. The reason we like a physician involved is for those cases where you're having trouble implementing a feeding protocol or getting their high protein in or feeding at all, and it's because some physicians saying, no, I don't want you to feed my patient. As you know, that's better handled peer-to-peer, physician-to-physician. So we'd like you to be partnered with a physician champion to sort of move this protocol forward. I will say we've made exceptions to the rules, and if you want to engage me offline with some reason why it should be fine for a nurse and a dietitian or someone else and a dietitian to do that, I'm open to consideration. But the more disciplines you have involved in the leadership of the trial, the more successful I believe you will be. So it's not ideal just to have sort of two dietitians off in the corner doing this by themselves. Rather, no, they need to engage the multidisciplinary team. And any questions on suitability of site or what I said about PI?
Yep, I have a question from Rachel Hammond. She missed what was said about the critical care nutrition knowledge. How do we prove this other than being a registered dietitian?
Well, that would suffice if you have some sort of a license or a statement that attests to your credentials. And I guess for physicians, we wouldn't necessarily have that, but our CV might demonstrate that we've trained in critical care medicine and, maybe did a project or gave a talk on critical care nutrition. So again, this isn't meant to be too rigid. Just, be sensible as to what the best tool you have to communicate to us that you're knowledgeable about critical care nutrition.
I think for dietitians, it's much easier because all of the dietitians involved in this study will be a critical care dietitian.
Credentialed.
So I think that's absolutely, well, I'm speaking on behalf of Darren.
Yeah.
I think that is sufficient. Also because I know of most of you and I know that you're working.
You're all good people and we like you. Yeah.
So just to confirm, you're happy for a physician to be a co-investigator and a dietitian to be the principal investigator, as long as a physician is involved in that leadership team?
Sure, and if you want to call them co-principal investigators, that language works for me too.
Cool.
Yeah, great. Other questions? Okay. Maybe I'll just give you a bit of an update. This is a global initiative, and that's super cool to be involved working with, like-minded souls from all over the globe. We have 33 sites activated to date. and 103 in the queue, 24 of those from the UK. I really think we need, north of 150 sites if we're going to get done in 3 years. So part of my plea to those of you listening is please get engaged, and also share the good word with your neighbor and your friend and dietitians that you may be connected to, not only in the UK, but in other parts of the world. The more hands on deck, the better. We have 235 patients randomized to date. So I think we're already the second largest protein trial, even if we were to stop today. I think Nephroprotect had something like 430. So as soon as we hit 450, we're going to be the largest protein-based trial to date. So the rate of sites joining is quite slow. We get 2 to 5 a month. I'm hoping that once we get rec approval and things happen here, we can list you all ASAP and get you going, because the speed of enrollment needs to pick up. Otherwise, I will be retired before we actually reach our enrollment targets. This is not so relevant for the UK, but in North America and other places in the world, we've actually been successful at obtaining a waiver of informed consent, because this is really research on medical practice. It defines what usual care is, and then within that scope of what usual care is, we're randomly allocating practitioners to behave in one way or the other way. And that argument has been successful, as you can see, in many jurisdictions where we've obtained a waiver. Here you will obtain consent, but it's from
next of kin
or a professional. The reason we're concerned about using next of kin is many people don't have next of kins, and there's a delay, and those delays, in the context of early enteral feeding, were too challenging for us. So we said it was impractical. But because you have that professional designate, that's your out if the next of kin are not readily available, correct?
And that's normal practice.
And that's normal practice for your research teams. So that's all I was going to say about site engagement and site issues. But again, I just wanted to make sure I hadn't missed some big thing that's going to be a big barrier for you on the call to engage. Any concerns that you have, or are you saying, oh, my site can't get involved because of, well, what is that thing that's holding you back? Please.
Darren, I have a question from Michelle O'Keefe. Can the research nurses take consent?
Well, actually, so Danny, we were just chatting about this before the call, and I thought maybe it would be useful, Danny, if you just explained how you're going to operationalize this trial at your site. Not to say that all sites have to do it the same, but I think just as an example,
Yeah,
please.
so just to give you an idea of how things will work here at Guy's and St. Thomas's, bearing in mind that we have 4 ICU dietitians, so things are slightly, I think, better staffed than many of the other intensive cares in the country. So I do realize it will be very different. And we also have quite a large research team. So do also bear that in mind. But the way that we envisage it working is that the ICU dietitians will screen the patients. And that will happen because we see every single patient on the ICU anyway. So it makes sense for us to kind of do that day to day. We will then be in contact with the ICU research team to find out whether that patient is eligible for other studies. We are also, just as a little side tangent, there's a lot of national ICU studies going on at the moment and international, and we will be organising co-enrollment for most of those. But if you have any local studies that you would like us to consider co-enrollment with, then please do get in touch, because I think that's really important that we can co-enroll with most studies. So once we've had a discussion with the ICU research team, we'll hand over to the research nurses, who will then obtain consent for us, whether that be from next of kin or from professional consent. And then the dietitians will go along to randomize and work out the feeding regimen. I think in terms of data collection, we'll probably end up splitting it between the dietitians and the research nurses, but I suspect the dietitians will probably do the bulk of
the work for the data collection also. But other sites have been in touch to say that their research nurses will do that. So it really just depends on individual sites and what you've got available to you in terms of resources. But that's how we see it working for us.
I just wanted to add, I'll highlight later in the presentation how the majority of the data can be collected after the fact, when the patients finish their course on ICU. The exception being the nutritional intake or adequacy data, which I guess, again, is in the purview of dietitians. So that needs to be sort of managed prospectively, and we'll come back to that later. Yes, Jen?
So the question is, once that free box of supplements has been utilized, how are the costs supposed to be covered for additional doses of protein or supplements? I'm not sure how expensive it would be. They're going to be participating in the European observational study by Fresenius Kabi, and the second bit is about co-enrollment.
Okay, so in terms of availability of protein supplements and enteral feeds, I think one of the requirements of being involved in effort is that you are able to meet the higher protein targets. I do absolutely realize that is a barrier to a lot of sites because you don't have access to those. But because we don't have funding per se for the study, there won't be any extra provision of supplements on top of what Nutrinovo have offered. So I guess that's something that you need to look at within your intensive care unit and see what feeds you have available. Whoever asked that question, if you email me, I'm very happy to chat you through some of the strategies that we've used in the past that have been helpful. I can talk you through those and see whether or not it's feasible, because it would be really sad to miss you as a site on that basis. So do flick me an email and we can chat that through. In terms of co-enrollment, European had initially said that they were not allowing co-enrollment to any study, which would include effort. I did flag that with them as a barrier to many sites being able to be involved in European in the first place. So they haven't come back to me as to whether or not they have changed that or not. But European is an observational study. So technically for effort, it's not a problem, but for European, it was a problem. So that's something that needs to be discussed with more detail with Fresenius.
I have another question from Rachel Hammond.
Yep.
Danny, based on what you were just saying, how quickly does the high protein need to be commenced if they are in the trial arm? I.e., dietitian only works Monday to Friday to screen, and the patient has been on the out of the hour regime for a couple of days.
So I would say as soon as you're able to do it. So essentially, once the patient's randomized, they should technically, at that point in time, start on the high protein feeding regimen. So I think what would happen as an example, let's say a patient was admitted on a Saturday, they wouldn't probably be entered into the study until the Monday, at which point they should start on, if they get randomized to the high protein arm, they should start at that point.
And just to say, yeah, you can start feeds before randomization. As per usual practice, within 24 to 48 hours, nutrition gets started. And then just to remind you, you have 96 hours to randomize them. And then, but once randomized, then we do expect to get on to the targets that are set.
I have two more questions.
Sure.
St. George's Hospital. Is there a time frame for a patient to remain in the study if they have a failed extubation and are reintubated? Can they still remain in the study if they are reintubated with, example, 2 hours?
Yeah. I'll make this point later on, but this is an intention to treat analysis. So once you're randomized in the study, you're in the study. You're not going to drop them out of the study. You may be unsuccessful at getting the protein dose that's prescribed for reasons such as this, but they're always in the study, and you should always be striving to get the dose that they're prescribed. If they get extubated or reintubated, you just, back up and do what you can to get them up to the protein dose. If they're discharged and they bounce back within 24 hours, then we want you to resume the protocol and the dosing structure. If they are discharged and they come back 3 or 4 days later, I would just treat that as a separate admission and not part of the trial.
And one final, sorry.
I was just going to say, and all these kinds of nuanced or detailed questions are contained in our procedures manual, which is on the website. Go ahead, Jen.
And finally, one question from Val Davy. Sorry, somebody else has put another one in. Our challenge is obtaining a product that meets higher protein ARM. We use propofol 1%, which oops, sorry, a bunch of questions are coming and they just bounced what I was reading. We use propofol 1%, which adds to the issue. We would need to use a product not currently within our contract, and this carries an increased cost. We have access to ProSource currently, which is still unlikely to help us in the high protein group.
I am going to talk about strategies to achieve higher protein delivery, but let me just say, I'm not providing product or funding. This is a pragmatic trial where within each site you've got to figure this out yourself. And in the end of the day, if we can't, if you can't come up with a strategy to achieve high protein intake, then unfortunately you won't be able to participate.
And is it possible to participate in the trial from Trong if we can only provide EN patients due to the potential issues with getting AA infusions?
I think I'm just going to
Yes.
that question.
Yeah. So if you're unable to obtain high protein parenteral nutrition products,
yeah,
and you can only enroll patients on enteral nutrition, then that's absolutely fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and that is it. Somebody asked if dietitians need GCP training, and I just responded and said yes.
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 Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on. I want to talk about patients involved in the study and what we can do to increase the number of patients, or what our experience so far has been, so you get a sense of our efficiency. I'll move quickly through this. You can see we're over 200 patients enrolled. About half, or just a little, about 40% of the patients screened actually get randomized. And that's actually not too bad. If you look at other RCTs, you're screening 10 to find 1. So here you're screening 10 to find 4. But we lose a lot of people because people say, oh, I don't think there's equipoise here. I think this patient needs a high amount of protein, or I think this patient needs a low amount of protein. We also lose a lot of patients because the 96 hours has lapsed, and that could be weekends or whatever. But to the extent that, those are two potentially modifiable factors that if we were a little more diligent on getting them to them before the 96 hours, and if we thought a little bit differently about equipoise, that might help increase the efficiency of the trial. So here's all the reasons people say that they don't have equipoise. They want to exclude them because they think the patient either needs the high dose or needs the low dose. So I'm not going to go through each of these. I just want to say that we're losing a lot of patients because people have a fixed belief that a certain amount of protein is beneficial in these scenarios. And I don't really think that we know what the truth is in all of these scenarios. We've created a nibble where we've summarized the pros and cons of protein administration, and there are a lot of cons. There are people who strongly believe that administering exogenously protein amino acids is harmful, suppresses autophagy, decreases mitochondrial function, decreases survival, etc. And so we just need to be thoughtful about that we don't have certainty about what the best recommended strategy is. I get questions like this where people say, for burns or for polytrauma, our patients must get a higher dose. We're not comfortable with the lower dose. And our response is, well, I know historically that's been our belief system, but with the evolution of the literature these days, where there are signals of harm, we really don't know that to be true. And so I would rather you suspend your belief, enroll this patient, and get them into the trial. We're not doing anything that's different than what has been done in the last dozen, nutrition trials. And I know this is a busy slide, but it'll come out in a publication in NCP in coming months where you can see that the control protein targets and what's actually delivered is very consistent with what we're doing. So we are just wanting you to stay the course with usual practice. Don't be fearful of enrolling people with burns, to a 1.2 dose, or don't think that just because they're on renal dialysis that they need a higher dose. We actually don't know that. There's no RCT level of evidence for any of these case mix groups. And a priori, we have some subgroup analyses where, gosh, if we had enough trauma patients in, we'd love to have, a trauma subset where we look at the high versus low dose and begin to get some RCT level of answers to these questions. So far, we're getting mostly medical patients. We have some patients with kidney injury, not very many trauma, not very many liver disease. So my plea is to suspend belief and err on the side of enrolling, but obviously, and at the bottom line, your boots on the ground on the front line, and you do have that right to opt a patient out if you don't have equipoise. But let's just be thoughtful about what is the level of equipoise, or what is the level of evidence pro-con in these different subgroups. And I've pointed out a few resources that might be helpful to you as you think about that yourself. Any questions or concerns from this group about, I don't have equipoise in this subpopulation that you'd like me to talk about more?
No questions here, Darren.
Okay, I'm going to move on quickly. I'm just considerate of the time here. I want to acknowledge that this is going to take work, and we've tried to nest this in your daily rituals or daily practice as much as possible, so that it adds only incremental work to you, with the exception of your startup activities, which is a lot of busy paperwork. And I apologize for that. It's not me. That's our regulatory and ethics processes that require all this paperwork. But once the paperwork is up and out of the way, dietitians talk about it taking, if you're screening and got a patient on study, anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour extra a day, depending on the complexity of the case and how difficult it is. What we observed in some sites that were super, super keen would they'd be screening and enrolling every consecutive eligible patient, and then by the end of the week they're exhausted and they weren't adequately monitoring the success of the nutrition intake, and so things didn't go very well. The work wasn't as high quality as it could have been. And so we were actually encouraging people just to slow it down a little bit. And yeah, we kind of want you to screen consecutively, but you can think about it as intermittently you're going to screen consecutively. So you come in on Monday, you've got nobody on study, so you start screening. Let's say on Tuesday you find a patient, you enroll them. Well, then you're going to stop screening until the dust settles, until you're sure that patient who's on study is achieving their protein goals, and then you have the space to start again. And so then you flip the on switch and you start screening again. So, if you only enroll one patient a week or even 2 patients a month, that's okay from my point of view. Just do it in a way that it works for your workload and ensures a high quality performance. So yeah, the other piece of work there is, which is what I think should be part of your normal habits, is to ensure that the patients are receiving that which, at least 80% of that which has been prescribed. And then finally, data collection and query resolution will be another piece of work. I think we say somewhere around an hour to 2 in total to collect all the data, depending on how long that patient stayed in the ICU. That gives you a sense of what you're signing up for. And again, I appreciate your willingness to partner with us to do this trial, to get an answer to this question. I'm giving you an opportunity to participate in research and to really elevate the practice of nutrition in your ICU, but obviously you're shouldering a lot of the work and doing that yourselves at your local sites, which I appreciate.
Darren, I had a question from Craig Brandwood asking about hematology patients requiring CAR T-cell therapy. Anybody having experience in this cohort?
Requiring CAR T cell?
Yeah,
I don't
therapy.
know what that is. Not stem cell therapy?
I don't, let me see, what is...
Anyway, no, I don't have any experience. I'm not too concerned. I mean, if they meet the other inclusion-exclusion criteria, they certainly would be eligible for effort. Any other questions, Jen?
Nope, that's it for now.
Okay, guys, I'm going to plow through the rest of these slides. These are some preliminary data from the first 83 patients. And you can see that the low dose group on average is about 0.9 and the high dose group averages around 1.5. So we still have about a 0.6 separation in the groups, which is okay, but I'd like it to be better. This is one outstanding site in Guadalajara, Mexico, who happened to use the PEP-UP protocol. And so you can see by day 2-3, they're hitting their targets in the high group. And by day 3-4, they're hitting their targets in the low group, and they have really, really good separation of groups. This is an unnamed site, and yeah, you can see that they're struggling for the first 5 days with hardly any nutrition in both groups. So this is a site, for example, that we would put on hold and say, whoa, 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 don't randomize any more patients until you optimize your feeding protocol and you start using protein supplements, etc. So there are going to be a couple of quality checks. We'll want to have touch base calls with you where we review your first 4 cases, and we'll look at graphs just like this with you and discuss your feeding practices. And we may or may not have a second touch base call, and we may or may not have some central or remote source verification. And then the last way that we're going to assess quality, of course, is the benchmark reports. Once you get 30 patients worth of data entered, we'll submit to you your benchmark report that you can then turn around and use as a quality improvement initiative. Now, I've kind of talked about this, and so I may not say much more. We are not recommending a particular product or nutritional strategy. It's whatever you use locally to get the job done. Obviously, there are these things out there, high protein containing enteral solutions, protein supplements, parenteral nutrition, including newer high nitrogen containing solutions, parenteral amino acids, or any combination of the above. And I was going to go through several slides demonstrating how useful and safe and effective each of those interventions can be, but in the interest of time, I'll just skip that. I will stress that, again, intention to treat analysis, that if they're randomized to the high group and you don't quite get there, or you don't get quite to 80%, it's not like they're kicked out of the study and you should just give up. No, you got to keep coming back every day and trying to get closer to goal. These patients will always be in the study. We have a tool built into REDCap. REDCap is the data collection system that we will use. It's web-based, and provided that you enter in the raw variables, what was actually the intake, you can get these energy and protein adequacy reports on a daily basis from REDCap. I'm going to skip these slides. Great. Well, actually, that's all I wanted to say, and so we just have a few minutes left. And I want to just see if there are any burning questions that people have, and don't feel pressured in the few minutes. If you do have some questions, feel free to email Jennifer or myself or Danny. Are there other outstanding questions people would like to verbalize at this point?
Yeah, no. I have one. Go ahead. Okay, well, Trong had an email, had a chat question. Has there been any problems with patients in the intervention group with biochemical abnormalities? Example, sodium.
I don't know the answer to that. Again, this is a practice-based trial, so we're not responsible for that. We don't actually collect serum sodiums. There could be multi-factors. The cause of it could be multifactorial. I think the only thing we really collect in our labs are things related to metabolic tolerance. So we are interested in capturing glucoses, insulins, triglycerides, ureas, phosphates, not sodium so much.
Okay, no further questions here.
Anybody else have any last question? I'm gonna give the last word to Danny here in a minute, just to sort of restate where we go from here. But before I hand over to her to wrap up, any other outstanding questions?
Hi, this is Adam Brookside. It's Anushka here. We just had one question about consent. Maybe more about telephone assent with patients' relatives if they're not there in person. Is that something we could consider if we can't do it face to face?
Hi, Nush. I can't remember if I put that in the protocol, but let me check, because actually that's not a bad idea. I've done that once. We did that in the bolus feeding study, and if I'm completely honest, I really didn't like phone consent because I found that the families were more likely to say no on the phone if they're not there. They just were a bit more anxious. But actually, I don't think it's a bad idea, and I can always put an amendment in. So I can't remember what I said, but leave it with me and I'll have a look.
Yeah, I think we've used it before in other, not obviously nutrition research, but for other research trials at Edinburgh that has worked quite well. Feedback from our ICU research nurses, so that's why we just thought we'd ask with regards to that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point, and I think it's good to have all possible avenues available, just in case.
Yeah.
It's not a bad idea.
Yeah, and just one more question. In terms of, I know you were saying about doing, if we recruit enough, in terms of having subsets, so like a trauma subset, what happens if we over recruit? Is there any benefit with over recruiting?
As in if you got more than 30 patients?
Yeah, and especially I'm just thinking because we've got the sort of major trauma unit for the east of England, so if that was an area that we could kind of concentrate, and obviously it depends, but would that be beneficial or not?
I mean, I think Darren would love it if you recruited more than 30 patients.
Yeah, it's a minimum of 30. We'd love you if you stuck with us until we're done. So.
And also, from your point of view, in terms of you know, portfolio funding, it might be more helpful if you recruited more patients, but otherwise, up to you guys.
Yeah. So it's a minimum of 30 to get a site report, but please consider there's no lid on the top. And, you know, if you were a trauma unit and you wanted to see as many trauma patients in as possible, so we have a large subgroup, yeah, great. Help us out. That'd be awesome.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks, Darren.
No, thank you. Danny, any last words from your side?
I just really wanted to say thank you, one, to all of you for your time on the webinar today, but also your interest in effort. I've had a lot of emails coming through with lots of great questions, and I'm really excited that so many dietitians get to be involved in research, but also the support that they're getting from the research nurses and medical team. I know a lot of you are on the call today, so thank you for that. And I did forget to mention just before, I get a lot of questions about how to manage the PN side of things in terms of protein, which I haven't talked about. I've really focused a bit on EN today. As some of you will probably know, the PN companies are bringing out some higher protein parenteral nutrition products, and some of them have expressed a hopeful willingness to be able to support us in some way, although we don't really know what that looks like yet. So if you do have a lot of PN patients like we do, for example, and we would like to really include those in the study, do get in touch with your local PN rep and see, you know, what options are available. I think that's a really good way of doing it. And I was going to say one other thing, which I've completely forgotten. But anyway, I am just really excited to get going. I think it's great. And please do keep coming back to me with any questions that you have. I'm very happy to answer them.
I have some questions, Darren. They've been popping up while you guys are finishing up here. Can I ask away?
Sure.
One is about payment. Is there no payment at all per recruit, Danny?
Only what's available by the portfolio.
Okay. And that came from Claire Harrop. Then St. George's Hospital. Are patients eligible that are admitted with a trach that are, example, admitted with HAP and are therefore ventilated?
who already have I'm assuming that's patients who are maybe on home ventilation with tracheostomy already.
That's all the questions.
Consider the tracheostomy to be a limiter and a reason to exclude them. No. So that, yes, they would be eligible, provided they meet all the other criteria.
Perfect. And then finally, once recruited, does data need to be collected daily for the duration of intubation, assuming retrospective data collection for weekends, ? And we occasionally have long stay patients, example, months.
You can answer that, Jen.
Well, correct. We're only collecting data for the first 7 days of the trial and while they're mechanically ventilated. Wait. And yeah, 12 days, sorry. And until they fully transition to oral feeds. So once you have a patient that is totally off enteral nutrition, then you stop your data collection other than outcomes. So yes, and you can do retrospective data collection for weekends. Again, if you're trying to do your adequacy, then you'll just need to, if you have other ways of monitoring that, you just need to, if you don't, then you can use the REDCap tools Darren has indicated. We will be putting, eventually once all the resources become available for the UK, there'll be a repository on the Effort website that will have all of the tools and information that will help you to work through REDCap, how to use the query system. I'm not sure if a lot of you are familiar with working with REDCap, how many of you are past INF sites that have that knowledge base, but there are modules on the Effort website that are available. So would encourage you to go through these before you start. And then if you have any questions, by all means, send them along, but a lot of your answers will be in here. There are worksheets to help you collect data daily. So all of this can be found on the website. Sorry, another question. Sorry, I couldn't quite hear you. Do you just keep the patient on a protein dose for 12 days or until off NG feeds?
Is the intervention just for the 12 days, or is it until they transition to oral intake or leave the ICU? I think that's what that's
and you're going to treat them as long as they're in your ICU in that protein dose. What Jennifer was just talking about was just the data collection to support that. We truncated at 12 days just to make it easier on you, so for those long stay patients to stay 3 months, no, we're not collecting 3 months of data, just 12 days on daily data, but 28 days for just the protein dose. But you continue the dosing for as long as they're in your ICU.
And as Darren had said earlier, if they get discharged and return within 24 hours, you still continue when they come back.
I'm really sorry, I'm a little confused. So can I just clarify, what you mean is that data is captured for 12 days, regardless of whether the protein dose continues beyond 12 days, or do you record data until the protein dose stops?
Protein data is collected for a maximum of 28 days.
Correct.
Every other data point that we collect daily, such as caloric intake, glucose, phosphate, blah, 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 is collected for a maximum of 12 days. If the patient's discharged earlier from the ICU, you stop at discharge. So if they only last
or if the patient dies.
Or if the patient dies, correct. Yeah. So we're trying to set maximums to minimize the amount of data you collect.
Perfect. Thank you. Sorry, we couldn't quite get our heads around what you meant for a second with the 12 and the 28 days, but it now makes perfect sense. Thank you. Sorry.
No worries. Yeah. So what do people see on their screen right now?
The website.
Okay, good. That's what I've been trying to pull up. So guys, I just wanted to highlight that on our website, if you click on the Effort logo, you'll be able to get access to
technically should work.
Technically it should work. So that's where we put all our files and our documents, is right on the website. And it's organized in a way that kind of makes sense from the flow of getting started, register your ICU, prepare and promote, etc. And if you click on each of these crosses, it'll explode into, a larger number of documents. So you should have all the resources that you need. And of course, if you have any outstanding questions, then please contact Jennifer or myself, or if it's UK related, if it's effort trial related, direct them to Jennifer. But if it's something logistical or to do with RAC, or then engage Danny for the time being. All right. Well, if there's no more questions, let me again express my gratitude for the time spent today and your willingness to engage with us in this trial. Look forward to having you a part of this global initiative. It's really been an exciting project that will not only answer an important clinical question, but around the world, nutrition's getting a little higher valuation because people are doing research in it. Doctors are engaged, talking to dietitians about it. So it's having a net positive effect. And yeah, we really appreciate each of you for your willingness to join this collaborative. So keep in touch. Look forward to having you on board soon. And again, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Cheers. Cheers.